Hi, and welcome to the video. Today, we are diving into an interesting reality story. Sit back, relax, and enjoy.
I never imagined our lives would take such a turn. Moving from Ohio to Austin with Jake was supposed to be the next big chapter in our journey together. We'd been together for 4 years, and while we'd faced our share of ups and downs, I always believed we'd emerge stronger. At least, that's what I told myself. But as we navigated the twists and turns of the highway, towing a U-Haul packed with the remnants of our life, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake wasn't entirely present, like something was pulling him away. I sat beside him, scrolling through my phone and occasionally glancing out the window. The golden light of the setting sun bathed everything in warmth, and I tried to soak in the moment. A new state, a new city, a new adventure. It was everything I had been hoping for. Still, there was this nagging feeling, a small voice in the back of my mind that told me Jake wasn't as excited as I was. The road trip started like any other, a mix of excitement and fatigue. We spent the first few hours discussing how we'd decorate our new apartment and which parts of Austin we'd explore first. I couldn't wait to dive into the local art scene and expand my photography business. Jake seemed enthusiastic about his new tech job, but as the miles rolled by, he grew quieter. At one point, I dozed off, resting my head against the window, lulled to sleep by the hum of the tires on the road. When I woke up, Jake was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road. "How much longer?" I asked, stretching and shaking off the grogginess. "A couple more hours," he replied, forcing a smile. "You hungry?" We stopped at a roadside diner, the kind with neon signs that flickered in the dusk. Sharing a plate of fries, I started rambling about how I couldn't wait to photograph Austin's street art. Jake nodded, but his responses were clipped, distracted. I chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, he was the one doing all the driving. Still, something felt off. That night, we stayed at a motel. I fell asleep almost immediately, worn out from the long day of travel. But at some point in the night, I stirred and noticed Jake wasn't in bed. I assumed he'd gone to the bathroom or stepped out for some air, so I didn't think much of it. When he finally slipped back into bed, I caught a faint whiff of cold night air on him. "You okay?" I murmured, half asleep. "Yeah," he whispered. "Just needed some air. Go back to sleep." The next morning, we were back on the road. I tried to brush off my unease. Moving was stressful, and Jake had always been the type to internalize things. As we crossed the Texas state line, I snapped a picture and posted it on Instagram with the caption, "New Beginnings." For a moment, I let myself believe it was true, that this move was exactly what we needed to breathe new life into our relationship. Unpacking at our new apartment kept us busy for the first few days. We fell into a rhythm, arranging furniture and making endless trips to Target for things we hadn't realized we'd need. Jake seemed a little more himself, and I allowed myself to hope that whatever had been weighing on him during the trip was behind us. But then the late nights started. At first, it was understandable. His new job was demanding, and he was eager to make a good impression. But as the days turned into weeks, I noticed a pattern. He'd step outside to take calls or stay late at work without much explanation. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, saying he was just trying to get acclimated. One evening, I suggested we go out to celebrate our first week in Austin. I picked a trendy spot downtown, a place with patio seating and string lights that gave it a magical glow. As we sipped cocktails, I reached across the table to take his hand. "I think this move was the best decision we've ever made," I said, smiling. "Yeah," he replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Me too." For a moment, everything felt perfect. But as we walked back to the car, I noticed Jake checking his phone more than usual, his expression unreadable. I told myself not to overthink it. We were just settling in, and things would get better. They had to. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Jake was slipping away from me. And I didn't know how to stop it. After that night, I started to notice more signs. They were small at first, moments that might have meant nothing if I weren't already on edge. Jake's phone became an extension of his hand, always within reach and often angled away from me. He'd slip outside to take calls, his voice low, his tone curt. When I asked who it was, he'd say it was work or his mom, but his explanations never quite added up. I told myself I was imagining things. Moving was stressful, and Jake had always been private about his feelings. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more those moments added up. Like the night I found him sitting in the living room long after I'd gone to bed, his laptop open and a tense look on his face. He didn't hear me come in, and when I asked what he was working on, he quickly closed the screen. Just catching up on emails, he said, but his voice betrayed him. I tried to push away the unease. I threw myself into setting up the apartment and planning my photography work, hoping the busyness would drown out my doubts. But they kept creeping in, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. One evening, while Jake was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, my heart pounding. A name I didn't recognize, Damien, flashed across the screen. I hesitated. Snooping wasn't like me, and I knew it could lead to more problems than it solved. But something about the message, just a simple, "Can't wait to see you," sent a chill down my spine. I didn't touch the phone. Instead, I went to the bedroom and waited, my mind racing with questions I couldn't ask. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. Jake's late nights became more frequent, and his excuses felt thinner each time. He'd come home tired and distracted, offering a quick kiss on the cheek before disappearing into his office or falling asleep on the couch. I tried to bring us back together, planning date nights, cooking his favorite meals, even suggesting a weekend getaway, but nothing seemed to reach him. One night, I decided to confront him. We were sitting at the dinner table, the silence between us louder than the clinking of our forks. "Jake," I began, my voice trembling, "is everything okay? You've been so distant lately. I feel like we're drifting apart." He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. "It's just work," he said, running a hand through his hair. "The new job is a lot, and I'm trying to keep up." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that his long hours and guarded demeanor were just the result of stress and not something more. But the way he avoided my gaze, the way he shifted in his seat, it told a different story. That night, after Jake had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at his closed office door. I felt like an outsider in my own home, shut out from the person I loved most. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between suspicion and denial. Something had to give. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. While Jake was at work, I started going through his things not to snoop, but to find some kind of explanation. I checked his desk, his laptop, even his gym bag, but there was nothing unusual. It wasn't until I opened the drawer of his nightstand that I found something, a receipt for a dinner at a restaurant I didn't recognize, dated a week earlier. It wasn't the kind of place Jake would go for work, and he hadn't mentioned going out that night. My chest tightened as I stared at the receipt. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but I also feared what those answers might be. For the first time, I wondered if I really wanted to know the truth. Because once I knew, there would be no going back. That evening, I tried to act normal, but the receipt burned a hole in my mind. I watched Jake carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or deceit. He was cheerful, even affectionate, but it felt forced, like he was trying too hard to cover something up. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I needed more. The following week, I started paying closer attention. I watched his movements, listened to his phone calls, even followed him once when he said he was going to the gym. Instead of going inside, he met someone in the parking lot, a man I didn't recognize. They talked for a few minutes, their conversation too far away for me to hear, and then Jake got into his car and drove away. I sat in my car, my heart pounding. My worst fears were beginning to take shape, but I still didn't have the whole picture. I needed to know who this man was and what he meant to Jake. Because whatever was happening, it was tearing us apart, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it. The morning after watching Jake meet with the stranger, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair, I felt my chest tighten with frustration and fear. My reflection stared back at me, eyes clouded with uncertainty. This wasn't who I wanted to be, a woman second-guessing every moment, every word, every movement of the man she loved. When Jake came into the kitchen for breakfast, I tried to gauge his mood. He seemed more at ease than usual, humming softly as he poured coffee into his favorite mug. It irritated me, the casualness of his demeanor, as though everything was fine. "Do you have plans after work today?" I asked, my tone intentionally light. Jake paused for a moment before answering. "Nothing special. Just the usual." "Why?" I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Thought we could grab dinner somewhere nice." "It's been a while." "Sure," he said, flashing a quick smile. "That sounds great." But even as he agreed, I could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like he was calculating something. I couldn't shake the feeling that he already had plans he wasn't telling me about. The day dragged on as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would approach the subject without sounding accusatory. But no matter how much I practiced, I couldn't escape the fear of what his reaction might be. Would he deny it? Would he admit to something I wasn't ready to hear? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. When Jake came home that evening, he seemed distracted. He kissed me on the cheek and mumbled something about needing to change before dinner. As he disappeared into the bedroom, I sat at the kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached into my purse and pulled out the receipt I'd found in his nightstand, smoothing the crumpled edges with trembling fingers. By the time Jake reappeared, I had worked up the courage to speak. "Jake," I began, holding up the receipt, "can we talk about this?" His expression froze, the color draining from his face as he recognized the slip of paper in my hand. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice tight. "In your nightstand," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. I wasn't snooping, but I found it. Jake ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily as he sank into the chair across from me. "It's not what you think," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Then tell me what it is," I pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been hiding something from me." For a moment, he said nothing, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "It's complicated," he said. "Complicated how?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Who is Damien, Jake? And why did you meet him at a restaurant without telling me?" Jake flinched at the name, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair. "He's a friend," he said carefully. "Someone I met through work." "Just a friend?" I challenged, my heart pounding. "Because friends don't send texts saying they can't wait to see you." Jake's silence spoke volumes. He stared down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he admitted finally. "It started out as just conversations." I was feeling lost, lonely. Tears welled in my eyes as his words sank in. "And you couldn't talk to me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I'm your wife, Jake. If you were feeling lonely, why didn't you come to me?" "I didn't want to burden you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been so focused on your work, on making this move successful. I didn't want to add to your stress." "That's not your decision to make," I shot back, anger and hurt swirling inside me. "We're supposed to be a team, Jake. But instead, you shut me out and turned to someone else." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you." For a long moment we sat in silence, the weight of his confession hanging heavily in the air. I didn't know what to say, how to process the betrayal I felt. All I knew was that our relationship would never be the same. The days following Jake's confession were like living in a fog. Every glance, every word, every touch between us felt heavy, loaded with unspoken questions and unresolved emotions. I didn't know how to move forward, or if I even wanted to. Jake seemed remorseful, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine or if he was simply trying to placate me. I spent most of my time holed up in my office, pretending to work on editing photos while my mind replayed our conversation over and over. Jake, for his part, threw himself into his job, leaving early and coming home late. It felt like we were strangers sharing the same space, each too afraid or too stubborn to bridge the growing chasm between us. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of us from our first year together, laughing at a picnic, posing in front of a Christmas tree, dancing at a friend's wedding. We looked so happy, so in love. I couldn't reconcile those images with the reality of where we were now. Was that happiness real? Or had it been an illusion all along? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of Damien. Who was he? What did he mean to Jake? And why hadn't Jake ended at the moment he realized it was more than just a friendship? The questions gnawed at me, refusing to let me rest. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went to the living room. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat on the couch, pulling a blanket around me, and opened my laptop. If Jake couldn't or wouldn't give me answers, maybe I could find them myself. I started by searching his social media profiles, combing through his friends list for anyone named Damien. It didn't take long to find him, a clean-cut man with a disarming smile and a profile picture of him standing in front of a mountain range. His page was private, but his bio listed his profession, software engineer. Same as Jake. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I felt a pang of guilt for snooping, but I pushed it aside. I needed to know who this man was and why he had become such a prominent figure in Jake's life. I clicked on his profile picture, studying the details of his face. There was nothing remarkable about him, but something about the confidence in his smile unsettled me. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to confront Jake again. Instead, I tried to act normal, going about my day as though nothing had changed. I couldn't let on that I was digging deeper, not until I had more information. So I waited until he left for work and then started searching through our shared bank statements. My heart sank as I found multiple charges to restaurants, coffee shops, and even a hotel I didn't recognize. One charge in particular stood out, a florist. Jake hadn't bought me flowers in years. The evidence was mounting, and with every discovery, my heart broke a little more. I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream, cry, or confront him on the spot. But I knew I needed to be strategic. I needed to catch him in the act if I wanted to truly understand what was going on. A few days later, I got my chance. Jake had mentioned he'd be working late again, so I decided to follow him. I parked a few blocks away from his office and waited. Sure enough, just after 8 p.m., he walked out of the building, looking around nervously before getting into his car. I trailed him at a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. He didn't go to the gym or the grocery store or anywhere else he usually went after work. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit restaurant. My stomach churned as I watched him get out of the car and walk inside. A few minutes later, Damien arrived. They greeted each other with a familiarity that made my chest ache. Jake's smile was genuine, his posture relaxed, so different from the guarded, distant man he had become with me. They sat at a table near the window, talking and laughing like old friends. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language spoke volumes. For nearly an hour, I sat in my car, watching them through the glass. My emotions swung wildly between anger and despair. I felt like a fool for not seeing the signs earlier, for believing Jake's excuses and lies. But more than anything, I felt betrayed. The man I had trusted with my heart had given a piece of it to someone else. When they finally left the restaurant, I stayed in my car, too stunned to move. Jake and Damien stood in the parking lot for a moment, talking quietly. Then Damien leaned in and hugged Jake. It wasn't a quick, casual embrace. It was lingering, intimate. My breath caught in my throat as I watched Jake hesitate before returning the hug. Tears blurred my vision as they went their separate ways, Jake heading back to his car and Damien walking down the street. I didn't follow Jake home. Instead, I drove aimlessly, my mind racing with questions and doubts. Was this the end of our marriage? Could I ever forgive him for what he had done? By the time I got home, Jake was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I didn't bother waking him. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the receipt from the florist that I had pulled from the trash earlier that day. The flowers weren't for me. They never were. The next morning, I confronted him. "I followed you last night," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I saw you with Damien." Jake's face turned pale, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, he didn't say anything, as though he were trying to come up with an explanation. But I didn't give him the chance. I know about the flowers, the dinners, the hotel, I continued, my voice breaking. I know everything, Jake. Just tell me the truth. He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Then why did it? I demanded, tears streaming down my face. Why, Jake? Was I not enough for you? It's not about you, he said, his own eyes filling with tears. It was never about you. I was confused, lost. Damien was there for me in a way I didn't even realize I needed. His words cut me to the core. I wanted to hate him, to scream at him, to make him feel the pain he had caused me. But all I could do was sit there, my heart shattered into pieces, wondering if it could ever be put back together again. The days following my confrontation with Jake were a blur of raw emotions and awkward silences. I felt trapped between wanting answers and not being able to handle hearing them. Jake tried to talk to me, but I shut him down every time. The wounds were too fresh, and his words, no matter how apologetic, felt hollow. One evening, a week after the confrontation, I found myself sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine, staring at the fading sunlight through the window. Jake had gone out. He said it was for work, but I didn't even ask anymore. My phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was a message from my best friend, Lily. Lily, hey, how are you holding up? Want to talk? I hesitated for a moment before typing back. Me, I'm a mess. Can you come over? She arrived within the hour, a bag of takeout in one hand and a bottle of tequila in the other. Lily had always been my rock, the one person who could make me laugh even when I wanted to cry. We sat on the couch, eating greasy tacos and sipping margaritas she whipped up in my blender. I don't know what to do, I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. I feel like everything I thought I knew about Jake is a lie. You don't have to decide anything right now, Lily said, her voice soothing. Take it one day at a time. But don't let him off the hook. You deserve the truth. Her words gave me strength. The next morning, I sat Jake down at the kitchen table. We need to talk, I said firmly. No more excuses, no more dodging the truth. I want to know everything. He nodded, his face pale but resolute. For the next hour, he told me everything, how he and Damien had met at a conference, how their friendship had grown into something more, how he had been too afraid to confront his feelings. I was selfish, he said, tears streaming down his face. I didn't want to hurt you, but I also didn't want to let go of him. Hearing the full truth was both devastating and strangely liberating. It confirmed everything I had feared, but it also gave me clarity. I realized that this wasn't just about Jake's betrayal, it was about the cracks in our relationship that we had both ignored for years. I need time, I said, my voice shaking. Time to figure out if we can move forward, or if this is the end. Jake nodded, his shoulders slumping. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just, don't give up on us. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. We started going to couples therapy where we unpacked years of unresolved issues. It was painful, grueling work, but it also gave me a sense of hope. Jake was committed to making amends, and for the first time in years, we were truly communicating. But even as we worked to rebuild, I knew I had to focus on myself. I threw myself into my photography, taking on new projects and spending hours exploring Austin with my camera. It became my therapy, a way to process my emotions and rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. One evening, as I was editing photos in my office, Jake knocked on the door. Can I come in? He asked softly. I nodded, and he stepped inside, holding a small box. I got you something, he said, placing it on my desk. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures of us from our early years together. On the last page, he had written a note. I know I've broken your trust, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life earning it back. I love you. Tears filled my eyes as I closed the album. This doesn't fix everything, I said, my voice trembling. But it's a start. Jake nodded, his eyes filled with hope. And for the first time in months, so were mine.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one. Bye.